Support WrestleTalk!
Give us a subscribe.
To paraphrase My Chemical Romance, wrestlers scare the living poo out of me. I am one of those non-boxing YouTubers, which means I have the fortitude and combat proficiency of wet bread, but I do have a black belt in sarcasm and a 10th dan in finding stories online about big dudes being such big dudes that they scare other big dudes with their dude bigness. There are honestly too many scary wrestlers to mention, so I've had to remove some of the tough but sweet ones, the ones that could kill you with a waggle of their ears but are consummate pros behind the scenes like Abdullah the Butcher, Minoru Suzuki, Danny Hodge, who can still crush an apple in one hand at the goddamn age of 82, even Killer Kowalski, who once accidentally ripped off an opponent's ear in the ring, was said to be a total gentleman behind the curtain. The rest of these lads, let's just say that each of them has had at least one bad day of behind the scenes fury. Here are 12 wrestlers that terrified people backstage. Number 12, Steve Blackman. The Lethal Weapon may look like that white guy down the arcade who swears he knows how to use nunchucks and often uses terms like flanking and kill zone when playing paintball, but Steve Blackman was the real deal. When renowned jerk Dr. Hardcore Holly is afraid of pissing you off, that is a statement. The most famous story is of a drunk JBL going after Steve Blackman in an airport in Kansas City. Steve wailed on Jables with such kung fu velocity that people couldn't stop until he got his foot caught on a bag strap before forcing JBL to apologize to him in front of the entire locker room, or he would, quote, finish him. Wrestlers say that if he hadn't got injured after the first round, Steve Blackman would have won the entire shoot fighting brawl for all tournament and then killed and eaten Butterbean at WrestleMania 15. Number 11, Scott Steiner. If you look up Freakzilla in the dictionary, then you won't find anything, and that is why Scott Steiner killed the man who invented the dictionary. Big Papa Pump has what is known in the medical industry as the swollen crazies, which is when you become so hench that reality and sanity are too afraid to work with you. For a random episode of WCW Nitro, Scott Steiner just decided he wanted to bring a tiger to the ring with him, so he did, despite it almost swiping out Rey Mysterio's eye backstage while a young Seth Rollins felt a disturbance in the force. On another day, DDP and Steiner got into a fight backstage, with many claiming that if it hadn't been broken up, Steiner was in such a rage that he wouldn't have been able to stop himself killing Page. He also scared WCW promoter Bill Watts so much that Watts started carrying a loaded gun with him at all times. Number 10, the Road Warriors, also known as the Legion of Doom, depending on who you're asking. Hawk and Animal, one of the most successful tag teams in wrestling's golden age, commanding a huge amount of fear and respect from Japan to the US territories. However, like many successful wrestlers, they also came with their own baggage, and that baggage was often filled with rocks, and they'd beat you to death with their baggage. First of all, they were some of the stiffest workers in a time where wrestling still had pretensions of reality, especially when they wrestled enhancement talent, working them over so hard that jobbers would actually pack their stuff and flee the building when they were told they were facing the Road Warriors. Also, if you told them they were losing a match, they would place a hand on your shoulder and say, "Alas not, old friend," with a tendency to change the finish of a match on even the most respected wrestlers. And finally, Hawk once took a huge amount of sedatives before his match at SummerSlam 1992, and is there anything more terrifying than looking across the ring at a man who could cave your head in, who's also not in full control of his faculties? Number 9, Andre the Giant. As Bill Apter once said, if Andre didn't like you, he should have been the most terrified person in the world, and looking at him, yeah. If a killer whale developed legs and a perm, that would be Andre the Giant, a man with an ungodly amount of strength and no qualms about enforcing locker room etiquette via real-life Looney Tunes violence. Andre's stories are legendary, from Hogan being terrified the Giant was going to go off script in their Mania 3 match and he wouldn't have been able to stop him, to the tale of Andre flipping a parked car that had 4 civilians inside, to wrestlers hiding from Andre because they didn't want to watch the Princess Bride with him for the 6th time and didn't want to make him mad, to a story we've shared before of Andre reminding wrestlers of their place by jamming his chorizo-sized thumb up their jacksie. Like all good giants, if you let him be, you'd be fine, but if you stole his goose, he'd grind your bones to make his bread. Number 8, Lou Thesz. Between the 1940s and the 1960s, Lou Thesz was one of the biggest stars in wrestling on a global scale. He was revered as a god in Japan, and even in America, Thesz beat pretty much everyone there was to beat. The reason for that is pretty simple. If you didn't want to lose to Thesz, whoops, there's nothing you can do about it. He was one of wrestling's last great shooters, i.e. someone that could destroy you with wrestling holds for super realsies. In his later years, he may have looked more like a milkman than a mat master, but he was a hooker, someone who could end a match with legit holds anytime they wanted. The original Sheik was a certifiable tough guy in his own time, but according to one story, Thesz was being so rough on him in the ring that he ran out of the arena and hid under a bus. Number 7, Ron Simmons. Damn, Ron Simmons was so strong that he once referred to himself as unequivocal, and no one has argued that point, with the enforcer Arn Anderson saying that he felt like a helpless baby in Ron Simmons' arms. During his tenure in WWE, Simmons, along with JBL, became unofficial policemen of the locker room, stiffing those that stepped out of line. Unlike JBL, who reportedly barked more than he bit, Ron Simmons was quiet as a church mouse until he broke the rules, at which point he would visit upon you a biblical vengeance. Mark Henry tells a story where Ahmed Johnson was reckless in the ring and Ron got hurt. Months later, when Simmons came back, he demanded his first match back be with Johnson, and every single wrestler in the locker room gathered at the curtain to watch Ron beat the ever-loving shit out of Johnson. Mark Henry describes it as like watching a lion or a tiger attack some helpless animal in the wild. Number 6. Rick Rude. Ravishing Rick Rude was your mum's dream and your dad's nightmare. He had a preening narcissist gimmick, but despite his suggestive tights and the kind of moustache that landed uncle in prison, he was one of wrestling history's toughest SOBs. Before wrestling, he used to work as a bouncer, and one night with his arm in a sling, he knocked a man unconscious with one slap. Scary men like Randy Savage would ask Rick Rude to watch their backs when they went out to bars, and one night Mr. Perfect scammed some cops out of $1,000 by having them bet they could beat Rick arm wrestling. Spoiler, they couldn't, no one could. Hogan reportedly refused to wrestle Rude because he knew in case things went off script that he wouldn't be able to break his grip, and not only was Rude fearsome backstage, but if you crossed him in the ring, he would slap you so hard you'd change star sign. Number 5. Bruiser Brody. Here's a picture of Bruiser Brody. You just wouldn't, would you? The man gives off a driven mad by eating rocks kind of vibe, like he's just emerged from 8 successive lifetimes in Jumanji. He was a huge star, especially in Japan, and was fiercely protective of his wild man brand, in much the same way that a lion is fiercely protective of its cubs. If he felt like he wasn't being respected by a promotion, Brody would often change matches on the fly, giving him a fearsome reputation of being violent and unpredictable. The most famous incident of this was a cage match between Brody and Lex Luger. For one reason or another, Brody got upset during the match and stopped selling all of Luger's offense. Luger tried to ask Brody what was wrong. He wouldn't answer. Eventually, confused and terrified, Luger worked out a brand new DQ finish which involved him just shoving the referee. Then when the bell rang, he hopped immediately out of the ring, over the top of the cage, and headed straight to the back. Number 4. New Jack. Oh good, it's time for a nice game of let's talk about New Jack being a dangerous lunatic without incurring the wrath of New Jack for being a dangerous lunatic. Thankfully, I'm the kind of guy that New Jack would just love, so I think I'm safe. New Jack's career is basically just a checklist of how to make people terrified of you backstage, taking drugs before and sometimes during matches, going on explosive tirades in the locker room where people can't tell if you're in character or not, and a detached, unsympathetic attitude to the business where the pop of the crowd trumped the safety of his fellow wrestlers. The Vic Grimes incidents best summarize the psychological mayhem that was New Jack. At an ECW pay-per-view called Living Dangerously, New Jack and Grimes were supposed to fall from a scaffold through some tables. Grimes wasn't sure if he could do it, so New Jack simply jumped off and pulled Grimes with him. Because Grimes landed on New Jack's head, nearly killing him, the next time they fought in a scaffold match, cause sure, wrestle more of them, good idea, New Jack took revenge by throwing Grimes so that he missed the tables he was supposed to crash through, injuring him badly. New Jack, you utter madass. Number 3. Harley Race. Here's Harley Race. He has a perm and a crown. Doesn't look like the kind of guy that would eat your soul, but he would. It's said that there are only 2 men that Andre the Giant was afraid of. One we'll talk about later, and the other was Harley Race. The stories are almost endless. He responded to being pranked by Owen Hart by tasing him. After a show, he broke the nose of a drunk Hells Angels biker and made him pass out in the ring as a lesson to the other gang members. And most famously, a story of Harley Race being annoyed by WWF's aggressive expansion into other wrestling territories, so he went to a WWF show, punched Hogan to the floor, and pulled a fucking gun on him. After all, Hulk Hogan always has had trouble managing race relations. Number 2. The Undertaker. No one messes with The Undertaker. It's not just a golden rule of life, but a golden rule of wrestling, up there with don't arm wrestle Rick Rude and don't headbutt bullets. For decades, Judge Grudge and the Cudgel Bunch has been a respected locker room emperor, settling issues between the boys in Wrestlers Court and enforcing the decrees of management. Famous Taker stories include him choking out Kurt Angle when he thought he was attacking Vince on the plane ride from hell, forming the Bone Street Crew to police the clique backstage, scaring off a group of men trying to carjack Bruce Pritchard and doing it with a single look, and most famously, taping up his fists and telling HBK that if he didn't put over Steve Austin at WrestleMania 14 as agreed, then he'd have the dead man to answer to. Few men have commanded more unquestioning obedience than the Phenom. And number 1, Meng. Holy shit, Meng. Meng, holy fuck. also known in WWE as Haku. He is the other man that Andre the Giant was afraid of, and it wasn't just Andre. If there's one thing that every single wrestler has agreed on in shoot interviews, is that Meng is the toughest and most fearsome man that the wrestling industry has ever seen. All of these scary wrestlers terrified of Meng, telling insane stories such as Meng being maced by the police, then no-selling it, taking the mace off the cop, and spraying it into his own face again. He slapped Tongan death grips on people that pissed him off in bars, bit the end of a guy's nose off in a bar fight. When Brutus Beefcake complained to management that Meng was being too rough with him, Meng grabbed him by the throat, lifted him 2 feet off the ground before Hulk Hogan had to beg him to let Beefer go. A bar fight starting and men knocking out 6 guys in 30 seconds. And most gruesome of all, when he got into a dispute backstage with a wrestler called Jesse Barr, he came within millimeters of gouging his eye out with his thumb. On a list of bad ideas, you don't tug on Superman's cape, you don't spit into the wind, you don't pull the mask off that old Lone Ranger, and you don't mess around with Meng. And that's our list. What are your favorite backstage stories of fearsome wrestlers? Don't forget to like and share this video around, subscribe to WrestleTalk for more news and lists, and never ever forget to jam that jam.